My name is Rachel Dexter, and I'm going to be your host for this evening's version of The Edit by the Melbourne Press Club. I'd first like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation from where I am coming to you from. They're the traditional custodians of the land that I'm speaking to you from this evening, and I would like to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. So, as we see people continue to trickle in, for those of you who haven't attended one of these events before in person or online, this is our third version of Lockdown, The Edit. The Edit is a forum for young journalists and early career journalists to meet, to network, to hear from interesting people working in our field, to meet one another and, get together. For a bit more of a background on who I am. So I'm Rachel Dexter. I am on the Press Club board, but I'm also in my day job a reporter at The Age newspaper in Melbourne. So we're going to run for about an hour tonight, and I'll introduce our special panel of three in just a moment. We're going to run, so before that was it. Before we get started, I just wanted to spruik one of our opportunities that's open for everybody at the Melbourne Press Club at the moment, the Michael Gordon Fellowship. We are still accepting submissions for this fellowship. There's about $30,000 worth of grants on offer for journalists, including freelancers and early career journalists, to pursue a social justice journalism project. A really great opportunity to get up a project that you may not get the resources for to do in your own newsroom. So those close at the end of the month. You've got about a week left. Would highly recommend checking that out. So we'll send some links in the chat box for that, I am sure. Okay, well, if I may ask my three panelists to unveil themselves from behind the Zoom curtain. Hello, everybody. Great. So I'm going to go around our panel of three tonight. I've not done one of these before with three people, but I'm sure it's going to be a lot of fun. So I will start with Silva Meza. She is, you are the executive producer of SBS Arabic 24 and a former presenter on Good Morning Australia on SBS Arabic 24. Silva was appointed to the role in April of last year. SBS Arabic 24 is a 24-hour-a-day, 7 days a week channel dedicated to delivering news and information in language to Australia's diverse Arabic-speaking communities. It's Australia's leading Arabic language station with 24% share of the weekly Arabic-speaking radio market in the largest metro cities, and is getting a lot of significant growth in online audiences. So, welcome, Silva.
Thank you, Rachel.
No worries. Silva's coming to us from Sydney this evening as well, so we'll make you very welcome in our little Melbourne bubble down here.
Thank you.
So we'll jump over to Christina. Christina Jha is the acting digital editor at the Asia Pacific newsroom at the ABC in Melbourne. So APM is one of the ABC's core international newsrooms, and it has a special focus on the Asia Pacific region and local communities in Australia with ties to the region, especially Chinese and Indonesian speakers. As a first-generation Chinese Australian, Christina has a special interest in China and can speak conversational Mandarin. She's part of a team of digital storytellers and bilingual journalists, and is responsible for writing and commissioning and editing news and features important to the region and from around the world. She's also part of the staff-led News Diversity Advisory Group, which has a mission to increase diversity in the ABC's stories and workforce to reflect all Australian communities. Nearly finished pumping your tyres up, Christina. Your role, Christina's role with the APN's has been with the APN since August 2017, and it marked a return to the national broadcaster after working briefly as a producer with ABC's 24-hour television news channel and as a reporter with Business Today in Sydney in 2013. The Sydney-sided then moved to Melbourne to take up the role of property reporter and Sunday Domain editor with the Domain Group. She began her career as a journalist with the Sterling Publishing's monthly Smart Property Investment magazine. Welcome, Christina.
Thank you, Rachel.
After that, I will take a quick sip. And last but not least, we have Fotis Kapitopoulos. Yeah. Got it right. The head of Cape Communications, a company specializing in multicultural communication. Fotis is a senior writer and consultant for Neos Cosmos, the English edition. So Neos Cosmos is Australia's largest Greek Australian media group. A lot of you will know Neos Cosmos as the newspaper. It also has 450,000 unique users online as well. And with a national distribution of 36,000 print editions, I assume that is, in Greek and English. Fotis was the multicultural media and assistant policy advisor for the former Victorian Premier Ted Baillieu, where he secured ethnic and mainstream media for the government's multicultural policies and programs, which will be very interesting to talk to you about later on this hour. And you also write for the Daily Review, Neos Cosmos, Opinion Online, and other publications. And also relevant to this discussion is that you are a PhD candidate at Deakin University, focusing on ethnic media. So, yes. With all that said, welcome to everybody. We have, there we go, already getting questions. Right, so I'm going to launch in. Perhaps I will start with you, Silva. I wanted to just get a bit of an idea about your organisations, your specific programs that you all work on. I guess I'll start off to ask you, what is the main difference between what you do and the news you produce versus what we would all think of as our mainstream news outlets in Australia? Or maybe I'll start with you, Silva.
Definitely. SBS Arabic 24 is part of SBS Radio, and with the latest McNair research, it's now reaching 55% of all Arabic-speaking Australians in Australia, and our digital consumption for just SBS Arabic 24 is increased in 1 year from 21% till 33% as weekly reach. SBS Radio is the world's most multilingual broadcasting service. We provide 68 languages and news and information and programs in 68 languages. We cater for community news, and with the COVID-19, when it has impacted significantly Australia and the world, there was big appetite on content produced by SBS in language. We had to give you an idea about, let's say, the consumption or the appetite for SBS multilingual COVID-19 website alone. It attracted more than 4.2 million Australian unique visitors and 8.6 million total unique visitors as at August 2020. So that would give you an idea about our reach. The appetite for news in languages increased significantly since COVID-19 impacted people's lives, forced them to change their natural behavior. So you needed to pass crucial and critical health messages because people were dying and people needed to know what they can do and they can't do to stay alive and to stay safe, to keep their environment safe, to keep their families safe. And maybe that's when the language became important because it was maybe for people with living certain cultures. Language is a key to these cultures, and that's why they felt they needed a trustworthy or maybe a media that they can relate to. That's why maybe the need, the appetite for news information, update, health information were provided by SBS, and of course by SBS Arabic 24, among all these 68 languages. To give you more an idea about SBS since COVID-19 impacted our lives, SBS produced 6 videos about SBS Corona, explained videos in 69 languages, 700,000 views, mostly in Arabic, Vietnamese, Dinka, Cantonese, Portuguese, and Punjabi. So that shows the appetite was big for people. They want to know, they want to understand. It is their lives intake. So programs were definitely catering for these needs as well. Language became like the key or the window for these people with cultures. As we know, in Australia, we live our cultures. We abide by the Australian law. We respect the Australian laws. But at home, we cook with our own spices. We eat, we live our culture, and we are encouraged to live this culture. So to give you more idea about SBS services, when COVID-19, like I said, invaded our lives, SBS launched a SBS Multilingual Coronavirus portal to deliver critical updates, and the appetite was just huge to follow this portal in languages. So probably I would say because COVID-19 was about policies that are not like political anymore. There were policies to keep people alive. So when people are in fear, when people are like they want to feel safe, they want to relate to what they're hearing, and the messages in languages made sense to them. They can, like I said, relate to it. When we tell our audience, it's okay, you shouldn't handshake anymore, you have to stay socially distanced. Maybe when they hear it from people who are culturally similar or taking their language, they will say, oh, they talk my language. It made them, I think, feel we are on the same wave. We know what you feel. We know that you want to go pray in your church, in your mosque, but you have to do it now differently. So it's this trust element that made languages really very important, and SBS services so much in demand.
For sure. Silva, I might just jump in there and just remind, because I didn't do this earlier, but remind that everybody watching tonight that you can put questions through to any of our panelists. Just let me know who you're directing your question to specifically. Our moderators here are going to compile them for me, and we'll try and get through as many as we can throughout our discussion, and I'll make time at the end to make sure that we get through as many as we can at the end there as well. So make sure you jump in there. Christina, do you want to give us an idea for where you work? I want to have an idea about where do APN's readers get their news from, and how are you using social media differently perhaps to how mainstream Australian news outlets would be to find stories and also, I guess, disseminate them as well?
Yeah, sure. So as Rachel mentioned earlier, the Asia Pacific newsroom, we are an international newsroom, so we do cover international news, but we have a focus on the Asia Pacific region. And we also cover topics that are relevant to multicultural communities in Australia, particularly the Chinese, Indonesian and Pacific communities, because we have those teams in our newsroom. So we in the Asia Pacific newsroom, we have the digital team, we have a TV program called The World, we have a Chinese and Indonesian team and Pacific team, which does radio shows called, there's 2 radio shows, one called Pacific Mornings and the other one's Pacific Beat. So with the 2 language teams, they have language platforms as well. So there's a Chinese and Indonesian platform, and so people mostly read the news on the website, but there's an app as well. And in terms of social media, I guess we function really similarly to mainstream media in the sense that we do Facebook Lives as well. They've been really, really successful, and we talk about topics that are pretty much in the news every day. So, for example, the Chinese team recently did a Facebook Live show looking at what everyday Chinese Australians feel about the rising tensions between the 2 countries. And we invite people from the community and experts to talk about the show, to talk about the topic on the show, and it's been very well received. And with the 2 platforms, they translate a lot of the English articles into Chinese and Indonesian, but they also do their original content as well. So there's a lot of collaboration between the teams. And I think during the pandemic, you know, we often hear that the community feels that they're often talked about but not really talked to. So one of our core missions is to actually also represent the concerns in our community, and, you know, even a lot of the stories we would cover anyway, like how small businesses are impacted by the pandemic. However, we'd also reach out to those communities and ask specifically how they're impacted.
Yeah, sure, for sure. And Fotis, how are you going up there? I wanted to ask you, so obviously one of the reasons I wanted to hold this webinar tonight was that there is a real element to this pandemic, especially down in Victoria, that there are definitely issues that run along ethnic lines. Why do you think, you know, we have you've been around working in multicultural media for a long time and working with governments and whatnot as well. Why, you know, we know that there are lots of different in-language and multicultural media outlets in Australia and in Melbourne. Why do you think that some elements of some parts of our community don't receive the best messaging, or COVID messaging has missed some groups in our community? Where's the failure in the system? Is it in government messaging? Is it, you know, the media sector not having enough resources? Is it literacy in the community? What's your take?
Look, if I can put my multicultural marketing or communications, not to be a bit softer on marketing, hat on, I'd say it's not always about communication. I suspect that every government, and I'm going to be quite bipartisan here because I'm going to refer to a question that somebody asked me privately and, well, through the Q&A. Every government in Australia, in my political lifetime, and I've worked with Labor and Liberal, have generally been on the side of, inverted commas, what I call public good. I don't think we live in a society, a liberal democratic society, where either the Liberal or Labor governments would actively do something which is as unhinged as what Trump does now, for example. I think we have a certain semblance of welfare for citizens. I would go to what Christina pointed out, and I think it's a couple of things, and I would agree with my colleague there, and as I do with Sylvia. Sometimes we talk about ethnic communities, but we don't talk to ethnic communities. And again, I don't think that's a malicious approach. I really don't. I'm quite a liberal Democrat in that sense. But I think there is a kind of a bureaucratic blockage, and I'll talk about that in part. I think there's also something much more powerful than just language, and this is where Sylvia comes in very importantly. And I'm curious to know too, because it happens to us too, who reads us, who listens to us. And I would suggest that both that all our communities have very highly articulate, middle-class, educated people in it, not only from within Australia, but from outside. So in some ways, the narrative that we're somehow uneducated or we come from such a poverty-based background and we need to be treated in a particular way seems to seep through the bureaucracy in some strange way. And I've referred to a kind of an interesting research that's been done recently on Iranian media in Sweden. And what this author says, and I forget his name, is that sometimes ethnic media becomes the vessel by which ethnic bourgeoisie, who are ignored by the mainstream, find a space. So suddenly ethnic media becomes an interesting mechanism by which professional journalists from whether they're in Lebanon, whether they're in Greece or China, find a space as a bourgeoisie, as intellectuals, which may not find a space in the ABC because they're not born here or don't have the capacity to do so. I think when it comes to communications, the real serious issue is not just language, which is a serious issue. It's also understanding psychographics. And this is where the marketing element comes in. Those particular...
Explain to us what psychographics are.
Well, it's from very Greek in many ways. It sounds profound, but it's psychographia. It's what makes your psyche tick. And I think a lot of dangerous stuff has happened in social media. And as a marketer, I'm probably partly one of the group that has failed society dramatically in that sense, because we actively look for ways to penetrate those psychographics, whether it's to sell things that we sell, and I've sold many things from the Minerals Council right across to the Greens, so it really, you find what latches. And there are a lot of young men, particularly, but also women in ethnic communities, and I'll talk about mine specifically, and I won't talk about anybody else's, who are born here, educated and or professional and or highly skilled in trades and other areas, who are no longer entrusting of government. And that trust is really strange because regardless of your political affiliation, most immigrant Australians, and it goes back to what Sylvia said, abide by the law and have had a consistent trust of these governments from Menzies onwards. It doesn't matter what your politics say, you generally trust the government will try technocratically to do the right thing. I've noticed anecdotally as many have in the last 3 or 4 years, possibly, people are no longer listening to institutions. They have failure of trust in institutions, and not because the institutions have failed them, but because they belong in a kind of ideologically fostered bubble. They keep listening to their own media, to their own advice, to their own groups. So suddenly in Victoria, some of the most anti-COVID maskers are young Greeks. Not all of them. I'm talking about a small minority, but a vocal and large, significant minority of anti-maskers, anti-COVID. The government's going to try and get our, it's a kind of anti-statist vision that they have. I want to ask an interesting question that came from the Q&A. My work with Ted Baillieu was fascinating for me. I am, and I have to say, I've got my guardian angel back here, Whitlam, just to remind me who I am sometimes. But I come from a long, historical, left-leaning family. And yet, as I grew up old, I realised that maybe it was one premier in the Liberal Party that could have possibly made the Liberal Party a Liberal Party again, as opposed to, the party that it had become, and it did become. And there's a reason why they blew him up, because the right wing of the Liberal Party didn't like a Liberal premier. The question was, he was a decent man, did well, and has the current premier in Victoria failed? Well,
we're talking in regards to COVID and dealing with multicultural communities.
Multicultural communities, and in dealing also with hotel quarantine and the whole disaster, the catastrophe. I can't say that the current premier has particularly failed. What has failed him, in part, I believe, has been a kind of approach to bureaucracy, which both governments, Liberal and Labor, have lost control in many ways of bureaucratic oversight. And in some ways, there is also another element, and it's quite controversial, it's my personal belief, not Nels Cosmos or anyone else's, that I think there's been such an overwhelming focus on issues of representation that you get a scenario where hotel quarantine, for example, the optics of having the Australian Defence Forces or the PSOs running it became a serious issue as opposed to doing the right thing. So suddenly equity issues came in at a point where crisis, really the only equity you should have is making your citizens safe. So that's my take on it. And I think, and you'll probably find with the current Board of Inquiry, that when you have 5 senior bureaucrats at $500,000 to $700,000 each saying, I can't remember who's responsible and I don't know who's responsible and I don't know if I sent that email, it's not a malignment, it's not a malicious thing to say, but there's definitely a lack of control somewhere. There's something broke in a system that works relatively well in peacetime but failed in war. They didn't go into war footing. That's my overarching narrative. I don't profess no.
If I may, Rachel, add a piece of information for what Fotis just spoke about ethnic communities. I want to leave the politics aside.
For sure.
It is this perception, like you mentioned, Fotis, that ethnic communities, they don't get the message because they're not educated. Just, I have few numbers that we just received like recently by McNair Research. As for SBS Arabic 24, 93% of our listeners are not born in Australia, and 58% of them have bachelor degrees. They're highly educated, but maybe they relate again to the messages, to the health messages, in their own language, not because they can't understand the English, but it's just because this cultural connection they feel, and it is not at all because they're not highly educated or they're not. So I want just to bring this to. It was a big number to us as well. To find out.
I'm not sure if anyone feels best placed to answer this, but I'm interested. The Victorian Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, about a month ago, when he was talking, about this issue of, outbreaks in communities where English isn't a first language spoken, and he briefly made passing reference to, what the authorities here are up against are people who turn to, I guess, social media, news, comments from their own countries or from their home countries that they can't really, that may not be of the standard of the SBS or Neos Cosmos or ABC. What do you guys know about, for your audiences? Obviously they're turning to you, but what do you know about your wider communities and their habits of where they get information from, and have you seen this sort of phenomenon playing out where people are, if they've migrated here from another country, that they turn to news sources or social media from their own country?
If I want to, may I talk about the Arabic community that we service as SBS Arabic 24. They did struggle with the messages at the beginning because we are so well connected and we are in touch with them through talkbacks, daily programs, and we have to increase a lot of our programming that gives this awareness they needed, because again the messages are not precedent, like we haven't seen anything like it in recent history, that you teach people to live a new normal, to change their behavior. So it's something that again goes back to the core of their lives. It's not something that again it's a new policy or a new law of some sort. That's why the messages had to be very creative for them to cut through the communities. We had to use infographics in languages. There were so many myths out there. We needed to dispel them, and the best way is to have experts and people of expertise to talk in our language to pass these messages. It wasn't easy task, and we're still working on it. And now that we are at the stage that we are learning how to live with Corona, the messages had to be I don't know, sometimes personal, because it's touching how you plan your wedding, your daughter, your kid's wedding, the funeral, how you go to pray in church, in
Are there
mosque.
the kind of questions that you received,
Yes.
Silver, on your
Oh,
talkback
sure.
lines?
People needed.
Very personal advice like that.
We had to do videos about, okay, you need to do the test. That's how we do it. We did one video, and to be honest, just last week it reached 1.1 million views, because it's just simple. That's how the test is done. So you needed to pass. It's such like unprecedented times, and the messages so much update that you need to keep informing your community. So too much there to take, and probably language was crucial here, because it gave maybe it connected better with community.
Christina, I saw that you were ready to kind of jump in before about, habits of people in your communities that you speak to, of their news habits. I saw you were ready to jump in. Come back to you.
So for the Chinese community, a lot of the Chinese migrants get their news from WeChat, which is a very popular Chinese platform. And personally, I think at the start of the pandemic, the Chinese community took the virus really seriously. So that's why I guess you saw that a lot of people started wearing masks and also avoided places with a lot of people, especially in those Chinese communities like Burwood in Sydney, for example, and Box Hill in Melbourne. And I think part of it is sort of reading that news from China and seeing the sort of strong measures that the Chinese government has put in place, like Wuhan, and sort of thinking, well, the virus seems pretty serious. So I should actually, so even before our government said you should wear masks, they already did, and they were judged for it. However, I do also think there's some misinformation on WeChat as well, because I think some of them who write or translate news for the everyday people, they're not professional journalists, but they are seen as news outlets, even though they don't claim to be. And I don't think a lot of it, the misinformation, is intentional either. Like a lot of them are just translating things and maybe it's lost in translations, or, they mix some articles together, for example. So there's a bit of that as well.
Interesting. So I'm interested in that, Christina. So when you're saying people are translating, so it's sort of like everyday people who take maybe an article or information from an Australian English-speaking outlet and are translating it, sort of doing their own translation for it on WeChat, and that's what sort of takes off.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of accounts like that on WeChat. I mean, maybe some of them are semi-professional, but others are volunteers or just do it out of interest. And there's WeChat, but there's also a online sort of whirlpool kind of like forum called Outsteps, and people also translate stuff. Sometimes they translate things from mainstream media, and sometimes they actually put two different articles together. And I think that might also contribute a little bit to the confusion. Yeah.
I think it's interesting what Christine and Sylvia raised about language. We found with the Greeks that they weren't not taking things serious. They took things very seriously, but some of the issues that we found was that regardless of taking things seriously, there's a kind of, again, a cultural tendency to say, well, I'm doing everything right, but I do really want to see my mother, right? So I'm going to find a way to bend that sort of rule. And I'm being on anecdotal evidence. I don't have hardcore evidence on this. But in terms of our response to the COVID and our readers, they took online, I mean, we've got, like I said, there's so many, they took everything serious except those that were ideological. Now, that's the interesting thing. Those that were ideological are fluent English speakers, have capacity to understand, and if they do get information from Greece, they get it from fairly solid sources, those that aren't ideological. But those that are ideological may not read us, may get sources from groups, chats, things that you know, like weird sort of outlets about G5 and one thing we found there's a currency amongst some, not many, younger second generation Greeks to be libertarian. You know, maybe it's part of the Greek thing about democracy. They feel compelled not to follow rules, but yet they do. So as typical Greeks, they'll complain significantly, but still follow rules, you know. In terms of the government, in terms of multicultural media, well, it's interesting because of this thing we have now. The Premier, we put a lot of pressure on the Premier because he wasn't giving us directly information. He was just giving us information. He wasn't allowing us in the press.
Yeah, I did want to ask about that. You jumped into my question.
Well, that was I guess blowing off from what you're going to say, we put a lot of pressure on Premier's media advisors because they weren't inviting us to the mainstream media presses, and we were hearing things about Greek deaths, Greek aged care homes, and it was really like Christina said before. I mean, come on, you're talking about 35% of the dead of the aged are Greeks, and most of the deaths come from St. Basil's Greek home. But what, you're not going to let Neos Cosmos or SBS or no one in, you know? So we put on
questions. Can I ask you this, Fotis, just to jump in there while it's in my brain? What were the questions when you were watching those press conferences before you had your opportunity with the Premier yourself? What were the questions that were not getting asked by the mainstream journalists, you know, all of our colleagues here, and no personal criticism of them, but what was not getting asked that you would have or wanted to ask?
Well, some of the nuance. I mean, it's easy enough to say aged care, private aged care is a problem. You know, there's been 35 Greek deaths, and yet, like, you're talking about it as though it's nothing. Well, it's huge in a community which the aging are dying, and these are pioneering migrants who came here and are dying alone. So there was the only one that touched that was Ralph Epstein. And that was because through various mechanisms and because he's Jewish, which is another interesting thing. He had the psychographic, he understood psychologically as a Jew that, hold on, there's something going on here, right? It's not just aged, there's a specific issue. Why are these Greeks dying at such a high rate? What it does do is it also, I mean, the questions that weren't asked is, why are the Greeks dying? Well, why is it specifically? And is it just because St. Basil's is a private aged care home which failed in its management, which it did? But is there something else there? Another question that we asked is, well, you know, you keep talking about a judicial inquiry, but we were the first ones before the mainstream asked, because we'd come in, we'll keep screaming in Neos Cosmos, hold on, why are you saying it's a judicial inquiry when it's not a judicial inquiry? It's a board of inquiry. There's a big... See, we have a kind of a tendency to be open to rhetoric as Greeks. We know how to spin. So in some ways, things were jumping out at us. And also we've got two voices. We've got the English-Greek voice, which is slightly different to the Greek voice. Now, this is very strange because the Greek media speaks to a lot of people, but predominantly Greeks from Greece, those that came earlier and older. The English one speaks to my generation and slightly younger. So it's not even you know, and the nuance is different. You know, you're
talking about in the way that, you know, Neos Cosmos would write particular articles.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, they're all professional journalists, and some write in Greek and in English. But the English edition or the English website would write almost as though you would read The Age or The Australian or any other mainstream, but with a Greek emphasis. It's a range of Greek approaches. So say St. Basil's, where we had to confront that reality. Now, this is very interesting for us because St. Basil's and other institutions, because we also see ourselves as an institution, not just a media outlet, unlike SBS or the ABC and my colleagues, we survive on advertising. So we survive on the networks we have with the community. So we have to be very, very, very careful about how we approach and how we investigate. So if St. Basil's, or just say any other aged care facility, forgetting St. Basil's, is one of our patron clients and, you know, buys advertising, how do we then start looking at them if we're critical? You know, so we need to think very hard about how to approach that. That's not to say we hold back, but it actually makes us more diligent in looking for the facts. So maybe we could get more facts than the mainstream can that what's really happening in some of
I
those
find that
areas.
very interesting, Fredis, because one of the reasons I asked you to be part of this is because of Neos Kolos's reporting over St. Basil's, which had a great deal more access than anybody in the mainstream. It's interesting that you kind of, in some terms, went much further than us, but you, whilst always also having to keep in mind these financial constraints of yours as well. Obviously, it's an interesting line to walk.
Well, it's also community. I mean, it's not just the financial, it's also the fact that a lot of our readers are in St. Basil's, or were, I mean, their children read us. And I think in some ways your colleagues and The Age and Christina's colleagues in ABC were coming to us first. They were saying, hey, listen, what's going on? Who can we talk to? Why is this happening? So our editors were getting constantly bombarded by phone calls from ABC, from The Age, from the Herald Sun, because they trusted us to tell them truth rather than to go directly to The Age, rather than ring up St. Basil's or whoever. Let's just forget St. Basil's, anyone. Let's say, well, let's talk to Neos Cosmos because they'll know more about who to talk to. And in some ways, we did a lot of groundwork for the ABC and The Age in cutting through. Like, I'd get calls from Margaret Paul and others who'd say, okay, well, who do I talk to? Mm-hmm. And having said that, Margaret Paul used to work for us. So it's kind of an interesting symbiotic relationship. We don't just hire Greek journalists or Greek Australian journalists. We hire journalists. That's our focus. Very
interesting. Christina or Silva, would either of you guys like to speak for your own organisations and your own communities about that sort of, it seems a very different relationship between, I guess, your audiences and your communities that's different to broad, widespread, mainstream kind of outlets and reporting. There seems to be, even I guess in Ferdis's example, a real sort of sense of loyalty or a sense of community in that you're performing a role that that seems to be a little more nuanced and almost a little more personal than what we do in mainstream outlets.
Exactly. The message, after all, it's the same. It's the same, but there is this cultural aspect that when you provide it like in an organization like SBS or like a program in Arabic, when you provide the same message, you are more sensitive about it, because I loved what Fortis said. We don't talk about these ethnic communities, we talk to them, and they are they feel they are like more engaged, because this connection, they can find it because they can relate to it. We inform them in a very sensitive manner, and there is the fact, the element of trust that they can feel when they, like, again, the language could be not necessarily a barrier, but it's like the English language should never be a barrier for them. But when they talk and express things like that, touch their daily life in their own language, there is this cultural connection that they feel with you when they talk your language, and we feel it, and they talk to us, they open up to you if there is something that really, because there was so many misinformation, so many myths out there that we needed to explain, to update, to clarify, and there is this community connection, and you talking to them, you inform them. It has this, maybe I don't know what's to give it a one word, but that's the uniqueness of talking to someone, the same message that they can hear in English, but when they hear it in their own language, I'm sure they relate way more to it.
Christina, maybe if I could ask you to touch on what we've just been speaking on, but what's just jumped into my head as well is, does that element of, I don't want to say like loyalty, but does that element of, knowing that you're part of the community that you report on ever feel like, does that affect, how hard you may go on a story, or, how you know, the way a story might be kind of presented. I'm thinking of, you know, like for you as somebody who's part of this community, you know, is there like a sense, for example, I know recently, about a month ago, there was an example from your newsroom that was highlighting some Chinese vloggers who broke curfew in Melbourne, and I think went to McDonald's in the middle of the night, and sort of filmed themselves and spread it on Chinese social media to sort of, you know, talk about how, you know, how funny it was that they'd broken curfew. You know, there's obvious, early in the pandemic especially, and I know that you and I have talked about this before, the Chinese community in Australia experienced a lot of racism. How do you go about, you know, presenting news that may not be flattering for your community, I suppose, as somebody who's in the community?
That's a really, really good question. And, you know, especially with the racism against Asians during the pandemic, that kind of topic, it is quite hard. And, you know, especially when you sort of experience it yourself and to report it, it is quite challenging. But I do feel like when we do report on these issues, we do it with more nuance than I think mainstream media. So I think with the McDonald's example that you mentioned, I actually edited that story, and I think, you know, maybe a lot of the mainstream medias might have just gone with a gotcha moment. But, you know, we actually spoke to experts and asked them, you know, why would they actually do something like that, and the impact it would have on the community. And the community was quite concerned that an incident like that, which is quite isolated, would really reflect badly on the whole community. And yeah, and, you know, afterwards we even approached the bloggers, and, you know, they apologized for what they did. So obviously they felt pretty sorry that they did it. So I think on those stories, I feel like we have the connections and the experience to sort of dive deeper into those issues. And with the racism story, that was actually one of the major pieces of content that we produced during the pandemic. So I'm not sure if you guys still remember the incident with the graffiti. This is graffiti, a family home in Knoxfield. Actually, that's a really interesting story, because it also goes back to trust. So last year we had this community engagement event where we invited Chinese community leaders and, you know, just people who are interested to the ABC, and we talked about what they wanted to sort of see covered, and we built some really good contacts. And one of the contacts was actually part of this WeChat group, which also had connections with the victim of that, who had their house graffitied. And, you know, because of that connection we had with that person looking after the WeChat group, he was able to vouch for us and say, hey, look, these journalists can be trusted. And that's how we actually, you know, spoke to the victim and broke the story. And a lot of the mainstream media outlets also reported on that story. But yeah, there were a spike in isolated incidents like that. But then we were thinking, like, how widespread is this issue? You know, we wanted to delve deeper. And once again, I feel like, you know, we should really represent the voices of the community. So we did this call out, a crowdsourcing thing, and almost 1,000 people replied to us, and there were hundreds of people saying that they experienced racism during the pandemic. And they're not all Chinese either, just people who look East Asian, you know, Japanese, Indonesian, Thailand. All these people said they've been spat on, called coronavirus, and some of them are even too scared to go out. It was really, really awful stuff. And being someone who actually scrolled through and read all of those comments, it was quite tough. And there were a lot of trolls as well. But I guess one lucky thing with our newsroom is that we had a really strong support network. I had my chief of staff, you know, contact me, and also other journalists who were working on the story and just saying, hey, are you okay? Because it's an issue that affects us personally.
Christina, while you're talking, and I really loved the way you described it, may I add, when the Eid celebration as well in Melbourne were like as well, it was like in the media something to blame for the pandemic or for how things turned really bad in Melbourne. We tackled it as well because the Arabic community felt very concerned about it and blamed for it. But there is this, I would like to add the element of respect when we speak about as well bad stories. We definitely raise them, and we even invited religious figures, leaders, to talk that it's okay if you celebrate the Eid like in isolation or not in big gatherings, to make them understand that it's okay, and to deal with the matter with respect other, plus the trust and the connection that they feel with a multicultural media. We dealt with it with great respect, and they got the message that maybe other media can't give it, or maybe the blame could be harsh on them. They feel like singled out. But when you talk their language, and because they feel you, and we understand them, they like to, like Arabic culture, they love to celebrate all the religious occasion in big family gatherings. So it was maybe just again for the message to 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 get through to them in a very respectful way.
We had an interesting situation. I think, let me touch on what Christina and Sylvia said first. I think what happens with our communities, and I include them in it, we have a sense of what Burnley once called ethnic honour and shame culture. So when something happens to us, when someone in our community does something wrong, shames the whole community. So
it's so true. And everybody in all communities feel the same.
It's something that sort of post-industrial communities, British, German, may not have, because we come from communities that late industrialization kind of leapfrog modernity into a new world as new countries, China, India, the Middle East. We kind of carried with us a lot of those traditional values, which are kind of strangely embedded in our families. Don't shame the family, don't shame the community, you're an embarrassment to us. What
the name of the family matters. Yes.
So it's easy
reputation.
Easy for us as Greek media to do what no mainstream media can do and say, look, this guy's embarrassing us. You know, he's really shaming the whole community, and the whole community rounds on them, which is not great, but it stops it. On another level, though, with religious values and things like that, we also have a very stark kind of conflict, if you want, or tension between secular and religious authority amongst Greek diaspora. So we had a situation, Greek Easter comes into play, just as the COVID first phase. And we had the Greek church arming and ahhing, not clear about how to deal with it. You know, God will save you. And we came out hard and said, God's not going to save you. Right? There's no way that God's going to save you. And the Greek community and Neos Cosmos came hard on the Greek church and said, listen, you guys get it together, because God's not going to save you on this one. So you abide by the law. You know, like
you have to stay socially distanced.
And they can't come in. Now, this is a cruel thing to say to aged people who look to church as solace, right? Because I'm not going to go, you know, I'll go for fun once in a blue moon. But it was really interesting how we were able to cut through that and say, listen, yeah, the priest is great down your corner. Yes, Father George is fantastic, and so is the Archbishop. And then we'd ring up the Archbishop and say, listen, get your shit together. We're going to blow this thing up, and we're going to, you know, you're going with us. You're not going on your own. But this is something we can do and the ABC can't do, or the Age, because they don't have the capacity to shame us. You know, we shame ourselves, thank you very much.
But it is so true, like you said, it is how to cut through the message in a very cultural, respectful and sensitive way.
or disrespectful way. I mean,
Anyway,
you know, we
yeah.
can be disrespectful to ourselves. Thank you very much. You know,
Definitely.
Guys, I'm just wary of the time. I knew this was going to happen. We are just like, we're flying up to the top of the hour, and there's a whole lot of questions, but I think you guys can see them all. And there's a few that are kind of targeted specifically to individual people. So I might let you guys follow up with those people and answer through the chat box if you like. But there's two questions I wanted to ask to the three of you to sort of round us out. And we've got one listener who's sort of wrapped them up a few of my kind of lingering questions into one question. So I'll jump to that. So we've got, hi, I'm Casey Bowie from Media Diversity Australia. It's so encouraging to learn of agencies in Australia established for and reach out and serve the multicultural communities. To what extent is there a need for a role in cross-cultural engagement between minority and culturally and linguistically diverse communities with mainstream Australians? How much is being done in this area? What are the positives and negative impacts of this engagement? And what are the obstacles to this engagement? What can be done to get around them? Essentially, yeah, what more needs to be done to bridge the gap between the mainstream and cold communities?
I'll start very quickly, and I won't take I think governments generally do what they can. I don't believe in perfectionism. I do think where they fail, if they not fail, or the challenge is, they should be talking a hell of a lot more to ethnic media. Having someone of Italian or Chinese background or Greek background, like Megalogenis on the ABC or The Age, talking as a mainstream is not the same as talking to ethnic media who talk in different tonalities. So we might write in Greek and English, but the way we write in English is a tonality that hits the psychographic of a Greek Australian, as do the Indian newspapers, as do anything else. So they need to talk to us. They just can't avoid us anymore. That's all.
Mm-hmm. Definitely there is more to be done, because there are a lot of wrong perceptions out there about many ethnic communities, and definitely there is a lot of awareness to be done. More we know about each other, I think more we live more in harmony, and that's where we at SBS we always focus our programs in this direction. We need to know more about other communities, about other cultures. More we know and we understand them, more everybody is happy and understanding and tolerant and accepting for each other.
And I think, we obviously need more culturally and linguistically diverse journos in our newsrooms.
Mm-hmm.
But I also think there's a lot more that can be done by journos who don't have a diverse background. And, I often get questions about how can we connect with the multicultural communities. And it's really just old school journalism, going out to those communities like in Box Hill, for example, speaking to people in the shops, speaking to people at the markets, selling meat, just asking, what issues do you think are important that we're not covering? What do you think? And just speaking to them like you would with any source, and really building that trust, because I think trust is pretty much the biggest barrier, whether it's the Chinese, Indonesian or Pacific communities. And I think anyone can really trust if they do. If they put some effort into it.
Anyone. I mean, it's interesting. What can the ABC do? Somebody put a question up. What can mainstream media do? Blah blah blah. I think what Christina says is absolutely spot on. I mean, right now, the ABC radio here in Victoria has got a young South Sudanese journalist, and he's working very closely. Now, this is very interesting because the Greek community is here is mentoring the South Sudanese community in building up the language schools and building up the sporting capacity, because we felt as a Greek community we should be mentoring the ones that are hardest hit by this. Now, there's a young journalist there. So the first thing we did is go, hey, dude, we've got stories for you. So you need to, and it's interesting, it took Greek, he's a South Sudanese guy from Sydney, but it took the Greek community to link him to the South Sudanese community here in Victoria. So
there you go.
For sure. And do you feel like you're getting enough access? I just wanted to sort of touch on, obviously there was the premiere the Victorian Premier's Multicultural Media Conference. For anybody watching who wasn't aware, obviously, as sort of touched on, there's a sort of an exclusivity around the press conferences, the daily press conferences with Premier Dan Andrews. And, you know, I know that you were one who kicked up a bit of fuss about that. Has that improved your kind of access to the Premier in his office now?
I think we scared them a little. There was a kind of a slight red flag about me joining any conference because I thought I was a liberal hack. But nonetheless, we had to sort of make sure that I wasn't. What's happened out of that, quite specifically, is we're setting up the Australian Multicultural Media Association. Predominantly, we want to extend that predominantly to, to commercial ethnic media because, as the good Premier did say, Fotis, pull them together and we'll get you a fund for post-COVID, which is the best way you can get us off your back is to pay us out, I mean, in some ways. But we're still pursuing it. We're still actually going to present him with a view that we should, if this association develops and it goes forward, that we should have a rotational representation. So, okay, you can't get 15 of us all at the same time in the conference, but if we develop a bunch of questions, can't one of us come in and represent the whole Multicultural Media Association and then pass?
Sort of like your own wire service or something.
Exactly, a kind of like loose configuration wide service and lobby group. If it works, it'll be great. And I think COVID's been one great thing from a communications perspective that COVID's done for us. It's pulled us together by Zoom because we just couldn't get together. You know what I mean? Like, it's impossible.
Exactly, in a way.
You try and get, you know, X amount of Chinese newspapers and radios and Arabic and Greek and African. Not only do our timings just blow out of proportion because everyone's late for everyone, right? So we can't get the other thing is it's hard for us to move across. You know, we're talking about a 6 million people city. You know, you've got the Chinese media down southeastern, you've got us here. You know, it just, so suddenly Zoom, we've got 15, 20 people bang on one hit. What we do find, though, is that the owners of these media outlets tend to be men. So now we have to find a way that women can be not represented, because they're always represented. We've got a lot of women. In fact, it's quite interesting. The owners are men, but most of the journalists are women. So it's kind of a strange, you know, blend. But we have to kind of figure out, okay, this is a commercial association, so we can't, you know, this is who owns this media and this is how we're going to be together until we find a mechanism for that.
Thank you so much all for your time. We were just over 7 o'clock, so I'm getting the wind up signal. But I just want to thank you all so much. This has been such a wonderfully refreshing and informative and fun discussion on, you know, what's brought us together is a really horrible pandemic, obviously, that's taken a lot of lives and really badly affected us. But, you know, I think, as you said, Fotis, is actually bringing everybody together, and the fact that we're holding this together right now and we can bring you in, Silva from Sydney, and get all these perspectives that the press club needs to hear more of, and the Melbourne community needs to hear more of as well. So I just want to thank you all individually for giving us your time.
Nice meeting you, Christina.
Thank you. Thank you, Fotis. I learned psychographics tonight. Thank you. Have a good night.
All right. If I give you a wooden horse, don't take it.
Well, we just wanted to give a shout out to the Copyright Agency who sponsors the Edit events. And they've been supporting the Edit for a long time now. Thanks to everyone on our panel tonight. We'll be sending a small gift their way remotely, so stay tuned for that.
Thank you, Rachel.
We'll put together some resources and readings and things from tonight that we send out on our mailing list, and you can join up to the Edit's Facebook.
And thank you, Rachel. You've been very good at pulling us together and having discussions.
No worries, I just bring you all together. And
no, that's not a little thing.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
See you later, everyone.
See you later.